Ethan Callahan had everything a man could ever want: money, power, and the kind of influence that made people whisper his name with equal parts admiration and envy. His face graced magazine covers, his name carried weight in boardrooms across the world, and his time was worth more than most people could ever dream of. And yet, in that moment, standing in the grand lobby of his headquarters, he found himself frozen. The crowd around him bustled with energy, employees rushing to their meetings, journalists craning their necks for a glimpse of the elusive billionaire, cameras flashing as reporters barked questions. None of it mattered. Not when he was staring at the small hand stretched out toward him, clutching a frayed, faded bracelet made of plastic beads that had long since lost their shine. "Sir," the boy's voice cut through the noise, uncertain yet determined. "My mom says you gave this to her." Ethan's gaze locked onto the bracelet, his heart skipping a beat. For a brief moment, everything around him blurred: the polished marble floors, the towering ceilings, the relentless chatter of business. All that remained was the bracelet. He knew it. He recognized it. The colors, once vibrant, now dulled by time, still told a story he thought he had left behind. He forced himself to meet the boy's eyes, wide, hopeful, yet filled with something else, something Ethan wasn't ready to face. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain his composure, but his voice betrayed him, carrying a rare hint of uncertainty. "Who's your mom?" he asked, his tone quieter than intended. The boy shifted his weight, his fingers tightening around the bracelet, before reluctantly letting it go into Ethan's grasp. "Sarah," he said softly. The name hit Ethan like a gut punch. His fingers curled around the worn beads, and for a split second, he felt the walls he had built around his past begin to crack. Sarah. A name he hadn't thought about in years. A name that once meant everything. His grip tightened on the bracelet, as if holding on to it would somehow stop the flood of memories that threatened to pull him under. Ethan blinked, staring at the boy, searching his face for traces of familiarity, searching for answers he wasn't sure he wanted. The resemblance was faint, but it was there. Something in the way the boy stood, in the way his eyes lingered on Ethan with an almost pleading hope, made his chest ache in a way he hadn't felt in years. The boy spoke again, his voice breaking through Ethan's daze. "She told me you'd remember." Ethan swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on him like an anchor. He was no longer the man standing in an empire of glass and steel, no longer the billionaire CEO the world admired. No, at that moment he was just a boy again, sitting in a cramped apartment, clutching a handful of beads, whispering promises to a mother who always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. He looked down at the bracelet in his hand, feeling its rough edges against his skin. A lump formed in his throat, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to say. The boy watched him, waiting, hoping. Ethan exhaled slowly, forcing himself to push past the memories swirling in his head. "Where's your mom now?" he finally asked, his voice quieter, more careful. The boy hesitated. She's at home," he said. "She's not feeling well, but she said you'd remember, and that you'd know what to do." Ethan's chest tightened. A long-forgotten feeling stirred within him. Guilt, regret, something deeper he couldn't yet name. The noise of the lobby rushed back in, the weight of 100 responsibilities pulling at him, yet none of it mattered anymore. Not when the past he had spent so long running from had finally caught up to him, standing right in front of him, in the form of a little boy, holding an old promise. He stared at the bracelet once more, the faded beads whispering stories he thought he had buried. And in that moment, Ethan knew. This wasn't just a memory resurfacing. This was something else, something bigger, something he couldn't ignore. Ethan stood motionless, the weight of the bracelet heavy in his palm, as if those faded beads carried the full burden of his past. His mind drifted back to a time far removed from this towering monument of wealth and power. A time when life was simpler, yet infinitely harder. He could almost hear the creaking of the old apartment floorboards beneath his feet, feel the scratchy fabric of the worn couch where he used to sit late at night, watching his mother, Maggie, moving through their tiny kitchen. She was always tired, her hands rough from endless shifts at the diner, but she never let him see her struggle. Instead, she'd smile, tired but warm, and remind him of the same thing every night. "You're meant for more than this, Ethan," she'd say, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Someday, you'll do something great. But greatness isn't about what you take, it's about what you give." Ethan had believed her once. He had spent hours hunched over their chipped coffee table, threading together beads he'd found at a thrift store. It wasn't much, but to him it was everything, a promise to his mother that one day things would be different. He had handed her the bracelet with such pride, the words tumbling from his mouth with the reckless certainty only a teenager could have. "This is for you, Mom, a reminder. I'm going to make things better for us." Maggie had held it as if it were the most valuable thing in the world, slipping it onto her wrist with a teary smile. She had believed in him, even when he was just a broke kid with nothing but dreams too big for their small apartment. But dreams didn't pay rent, and reality had a way of grinding optimism into dust. Ethan pushed himself harder with every setback. College had been brutal. There were nights when he slept in libraries, fueled only by caffeine and desperation. He took on odd jobs, coding in his spare time, clawing his way into an industry that had no place for a kid from nowhere. And as his world expanded, that old apartment and everything in it, his mother, her tired smiles, the bracelet, faded into the background. Success came, slowly at first, then all at once. First, an app that caught fire, then investors, and soon a company with his name on the door. Every milestone pulled him further from his past, and with it, the things that once grounded him. The bracelet had ended up shoved in the back of a drawer, buried beneath contracts and business cards. He had stopped calling home as much. There was always something more important, a meeting, a pitch, an opportunity. The last time he had spoken to Maggie, she had sounded older, wearier. She asked if he was coming home for Christmas. He had said no. There was a deal in the works, something that would change everything. She had been understanding, as always, but her voice had carried something else. Disappointment. He never got the chance to make it up to her. Ethan swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the boy in front of him. The sudden guilt of lost time pressed down on his chest like a lead weight. He wondered if the boy knew what this bracelet meant, if Sarah had told him the whole story. Did she tell him how Ethan had once believed in something more than money and power? Did she tell him how, somewhere along the way, he had forgotten? Sarah, Ethan murmured again, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. How do you know about this? The boy shifted his feet uncomfortably. She told me about you, he said, his voice quieter now, unsure. She said you used to be different. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. Different. That word lingered in the air like an accusation. He studied the boy closely, and for the first time, he noticed something. Something in his eyes, in the way he stood, that reminded him of himself at that age. A knot formed in his throat. Is she okay? He asked, his voice coming out more gruff than intended. The boy hesitated before shaking his head. She's not doing great. She said she didn't want to bother you, but I thought maybe if you saw this, you'd remember. Maybe you could help. Help? Ethan nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. He had built an empire from nothing, but standing here now, staring at a 10-year-old holding out a piece of his past, he felt powerless. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, exhaling sharply. Where is she? The boy brightened slightly. Home, he said. It's not far. I could take you. Ethan hesitated, his carefully constructed walls threatening to crumble. His schedule was packed. There were meetings, contracts, obligations. But none of it seemed to matter anymore. The bracelet in his hand pulsed like a reminder of everything he had lost, of promises made and broken. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Callahan found himself at a crossroads. Ethan stepped outside the towering glass building, the city skyline stretching endlessly before him. The afternoon sun reflected off the steel and glass structures that surrounded him, but for the first time in years, the sight failed to impress him. The weight of the bracelet in his pocket felt heavier than it should have been, as if it carried the ghosts of promises long abandoned. The boy, Lucas, walked a few steps ahead, glancing back occasionally to make sure Ethan was still following. His small frame moved with the kind of quiet resilience that Ethan recognized all too well, the kind that comes from learning to expect little and hope even less. Ethan's luxury sedan waited at the curb, his driver standing attentively by the door. The usual routine would be for him to step inside, disappear into his carefully curated world, and forget about this strange encounter. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way Lucas clutched his backpack so tightly, or maybe it was the unshakable feeling that for once he couldn't afford to walk away. "Where do you live?" Ethan asked, his voice more uncertain than he'd like. Lucas hesitated, shuffling his feet. "It's not too far," he said, avoiding Ethan's gaze. "Just a couple of blocks." Ethan nodded, gesturing for the driver to leave without him. "Lead the way," he said, falling into step beside the boy. The streets grew quieter as they walked, the towering buildings giving way to smaller, older apartment complexes. The pristine sidewalks of the financial district slowly transitioned into cracked pavement and graffiti-covered walls. Ethan glanced around, a strange mix of nostalgia and discomfort settling in his chest. This neighborhood wasn't unfamiliar to him. In fact, it looked eerily similar to the one he grew up in. Lucas remained quiet as they turned down a narrow alleyway, his steps quick and practiced. Ethan could tell the boy had walked this path 1,000 times, dodging potholes and broken glass with the ease of someone used to navigating forgotten corners of the city. Finally, they reached a small, run-down building with peeling paint and a rusted fire escape clinging to its side. Lucas pushed the front door open with a creak and gestured for Ethan to follow. The hallway smelled of mildew and stale air, and the flickering overhead light cast uneasy shadows on the cracked linoleum floor. Ethan suppressed the urge to turn around, to retreat back to the familiar comfort of his office. But something inside him, something deeper than guilt, pushed him forward. Lucas led him up 2 flights of stairs and stopped in front of a faded green door. "She's inside," he said softly, his fingers curling around the doorknob as if bracing himself for what lay beyond. Ethan took a breath, his heart pounding in his chest in a way it hadn't in years. The door creaked open, and the smell of home-cooked food, faint and barely lingering, mixed with the unmistakable scent of illness. Inside, the living room was small but tidy, every surface adorned with photographs, mismatched furniture, and little remnants of a life built with love despite its hardships. And there she was. Sarah sat in an old armchair by the window, wrapped in a worn blanket. Her face was thinner than he remembered, her skin paler, but her eyes, the same warm, gentle eyes that had once looked at him with so much belief, still held that quiet strength. For a long moment, she simply stared at him, and Ethan felt stripped of everything his fortune had bought him. "I never thought I'd see you again," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of years apart. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat, forcing himself to hold her gaze. "I didn't either," he admitted, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Sarah smiled weakly and glanced at the bracelet peeking out of his pocket. "You kept it," she said, almost as if she didn't quite believe it. Ethan nodded, pulling it out and holding it up. "Yeah," he said, struggling to find the right words. "I guess I did." A silence settled between them, heavy with all the things left unsaid over the years. Ethan looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the worn sofa, the stack of medical bills on the table, and the faded photographs of Sarah and Lucas smiling despite the odds stacked against them. "I heard you were doing well," Sarah said eventually, her voice laced with something that sounded almost like pride. "Built your own company, made it big." Ethan let out a short laugh, but it held no humor. "Yeah, I did." He paused, running a hand through his hair. I got caught up, I guess." Sarah's smile was gentle, understanding. "You were always chasing something," she said, "even back then." Lucas moved to sit beside his mother, holding her hand, his eyes flickering between them, searching for answers he wasn't sure he'd ever get. Ethan sat down across from them, feeling more out of place than he had in years. "Why didn't you reach out?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah shrugged, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on Lucas's hand. "I didn't want to be a burden," she said, "and besides, you had your own life to live. I didn't think you'd remember." Ethan stared at her, guilt twisting deep in his gut. "I should have," he said, his voice cracking. "I should have reached out sooner." Sarah's expression softened. "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." Ethan glanced at Lucas, who was watching him with wide, hopeful eyes. The boy didn't know the full story, didn't know how much Ethan had once owed to his mother's kindness. And now, staring at Sarah, tired, sick, yet still smiling, Ethan realized that no amount of money or success could undo the years of silence. He reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out something else, his business card. He held it out to Sarah, but she shook her head with a small smile. "I don't need your money, Ethan," she said. "I just wanted you to remember." Ethan blinked, stunned by the simplicity of her words. Remember. He had spent so long running from his past, burying it beneath deals and deadlines, that he had forgotten the people who had once been his foundation. "I do," he said quietly. "I remember." And for the first time in a long time, he meant it. Ethan sat in the worn-out armchair across from Sarah, the creak of the old springs beneath him sounding louder than it should in the quiet room. He looked around, taking in the faded curtains, the chipped coffee table cluttered with unopened mail, and the soft hum of a fan struggling to fight off the lingering heat. Everything about the place felt frozen in time, like a relic from a life he had long since left behind. And yet it tugged at something deep within him, a longing he couldn't quite place. Sarah studied him with that familiar, knowing look, the one that used to make him feel seen in ways he hadn't understood back then. Even now, weakened by illness, she carried an air of quiet strength. Lucas sat close by, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt, his eyes darting between them with curiosity. Ethan could feel the boy's unspoken questions hanging in the air. "I guess I should have called," Ethan finally said, his voice lower, heavier. Sarah gave a small, tired chuckle. "You always were too busy for things like that." Her words weren't accusatory, just factual, but they hit him harder than he expected. "Life has a funny way of slipping past us, doesn't it?" Ethan exhaled sharply, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Yeah," he murmured, rubbing a hand over his face. "It does." Sarah glanced at the bracelet in his hand. "I kept mine too, you know," she said, nodding toward the small wooden box on the shelf beside her. "It reminded me of hope, of better days." Ethan followed her gaze and spotted it. The same kind of bracelet he had given his mother all those years ago, now resting among a handful of other small mementos. His chest tightened. "I didn't think you'd still have it," he admitted. Sarah smiled faintly. Some things you don't throw away. The words stirred something inside him, a pang of regret sharper than he was prepared for. He had spent years discarding pieces of his past, convinced they held him back. But now, sitting here, he realized how much he had lost in the process. Lucas suddenly spoke, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "Mom says you used to be different," he said cautiously, as if unsure whether he should say it at all. Ethan met his gaze, startled by the honesty in it. "I was," he admitted, nodding slowly. "I was different." He looked back at Sarah, his expression raw. "I thought I had to be, to make it." Sarah reached out, her thin hand resting on top of his. "You didn't," she said softly. "You were enough, just as you were." Ethan felt his throat tighten, and for a moment he couldn't speak. He had spent his whole life trying to prove himself, building his empire, climbing higher, pushing further. And yet, here in this tiny apartment, he felt stripped bare, reminded of the truth he had once known but had long since buried. "How bad is it?" he finally asked, his eyes scanning the scattered medical bills on the table. He dreaded the answer, but needed to hear it. Sarah hesitated, then sighed. "It's not great, Ethan. The treatments, they help, but they're expensive." She looked down at her hands. "I didn't want to ask you for anything, but Lucas..." She smiled softly at the boy. "He thought you'd want to know." Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. He had built a fortune beyond imagination, yet the people who had once been his entire world were struggling just to get by. The thought made his stomach churn. "I can help," he said, his voice firmer now. "I want to help." Sarah shook her head gently. "It's not about the money, Ethan. It's about what really matters." She looked at him with an intensity that made him feel like a kid again, the same way she used to when she gave him advice he never wanted to hear. "Lucas doesn't need to see your wealth. He needs to see your heart." Ethan nodded, understanding dawning on him. Money wasn't the answer, not entirely. He had spent so much time believing it was the solution to everything, but some things couldn't be fixed with a check. Some things needed presence, connection, and something deeper than wealth. He turned to Lucas. "Hey, kid," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "How about we get some ice cream? I could use a break from all this serious stuff." Lucas's face lit up with a grin. "Really?" "Yeah," Ethan said, standing up and ruffling the boy's hair. "Your mom can rest, and you can show me your favorite spot." Sarah smiled, watching them with tired yet grateful eyes. "Thank you, Ethan," she said softly. Ethan nodded, feeling something shift inside him. It wasn't just about fixing things anymore. It was about making things right. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Ethan and Lucas walked side by side down the quiet street, the city's noise fading into the background as they moved deeper into the neighborhood. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the worn pavement. Ethan found himself glancing at the boy, noticing the way he carried himself. Confident, yet cautious, like someone who had learned to expect disappointment but still held on to hope. It struck him how much Lucas reminded him of his younger self. "So, where's this famous ice cream place?" Ethan asked, attempting to lighten the mood. Lucas pointed up ahead. "Just around the corner, they have the best chocolate chip ever." He looked up at Ethan. "You like chocolate chip?" Ethan chuckled. "It's been a while since I've had it, but yeah, I think I do." Lucas grinned. "Mom used to say it was your favorite." Ethan's steps faltered for just a moment. "She remembered that, huh?" Lucas nodded. "She remembers a lot of things about you." His voice carried a quiet weight, the words hanging in the air between them. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Yeah, your mom always had a good memory." They reached the small ice cream shop, a cozy little place with faded signs and a hand-painted menu taped to the window. Ethan pushed the door open, and the familiar sound of bells jingling overhead greeted them. Inside, the smell of freshly baked waffle cones filled the air, instantly transporting Ethan back to a simpler time when success wasn't measured in numbers, but in moments like this. Lucas ordered first, confidently requesting his favorite flavor with extra sprinkles. Ethan hesitated for a moment before ordering chocolate chip, a wave of nostalgia hitting him as the cashier handed him the cone. They took their seats at a small booth by the window, the warm sunlight casting a golden glow over the table. Lucas wasted no time digging into his ice cream, but Ethan just stared at his, lost in thought. He could almost hear his mother's laughter, see the way she used to sit across from him at a place just like this, gently reminding him to slow down and enjoy life instead of always racing toward the next big thing. Lucas studied him curiously. "You okay?" Ethan blinked, shaking himself out of his thoughts. "Yeah," he said, offering a smile. "Just remembering things." Lucas licked his spoon thoughtfully. "Mom said you used to have big dreams." Ethan smirked. "Yeah, I did." Lucas tilted his head. "Do you think you made it? Like, did you get everything you wanted?" Ethan stared at his ice cream for a long moment before answering. "I thought I did." He looked at Lucas. "But sometimes, when you get everything you think you want, you realize it's not really what matters." Lucas frowned. "What does matter then?" Ethan sighed, thinking about Sarah, about his mother, about all the years he had spent chasing things that left him feeling emptier than before. "People," he said finally. "The ones who believe in you when you have nothing. The ones who stick around even when you forget them." Lucas nodded, as if he understood more than a kid his age should. "Mom says it's never too late to come back." Ethan's chest tightened at the simplicity of those words. He had spent so much time running, pushing, striving to escape his past, and now, sitting across from this boy who carried echoes of it, he realized how much of himself he had left behind. They sat in silence for a while, just eating their ice cream and watching people pass by outside. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt grounded, like he wasn't just existing, but actually present. When they finished, Lucas wiped his hands on a napkin and looked up at him expectantly. "Are you going to come see Mom again?" Ethan hesitated, but only for a second. "Yeah," he said firmly. "I will." Lucas's face lit up, and for a brief moment, Ethan saw something that made his heart ache, a glimpse of trust, fragile yet real. As they stepped back out onto the street, Ethan glanced at his phone. Missed calls, emails piling up. The world he had built was waiting for him, demanding his attention, but as he looked down at Lucas, he realized something important. This was where he needed to be right now. "Hey, kid," Ethan said, ruffling his hair. "Next time, I'm buying the biggest sundae they've got." Lucas laughed. "Deal." As they walked back toward the apartment, Ethan felt something he hadn't in years. Hope? Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe it wasn't too late to come back. Maybe it wasn't too late to remember what really mattered. Later that evening, Ethan found himself back in Sarah's small apartment, the dim glow of a single lamp casting soft shadows on the walls. Lucas had fallen asleep on the couch, curled up with a well-worn blanket, his soft breathing filling the quiet space. Ethan sat across from Sarah at the small kitchen table, staring at the untouched cup of tea she had made for him. He traced the rim of the mug with his fingers, feeling the weight of everything he wanted to say, but couldn't quite put into words. Sarah watched him, her face calm yet tired, as if she had already made peace with whatever was coming next. "I missed you, you know," she said gently, breaking the silence. Ethan looked up, surprised by the simplicity of her words. He opened his mouth, then closed it, struggling to find the right response. Finally, he sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I missed you too," he admitted, his voice quieter than he intended. I didn't know how to come back." Sarah nodded knowingly, as if she understood without needing an explanation. "Life has a way of pulling us in different directions," she said. "But it doesn't mean we can't find our way home again?" Ethan swallowed hard, the words hitting him in a place he had long ignored. "I thought leaving was the only way to make something of myself," he said, his gaze falling to the bracelet on the table between them. "I wanted to prove that I could be more than just a kid from nowhere." Sarah reached out, her thin fingers brushing against his. "You were always more than that, Ethan," she said softly. "You just didn't see it." He looked at her, regret flickering in his eyes. "I should have stayed in touch," he said. "I should have been here for you." Sarah smiled faintly. "You're here now," she said, echoing her earlier words. "That's what matters." Ethan glanced at Lucas, sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the weight of their conversation. "He's a good kid," Ethan said, his voice filled with something close to admiration. Sarah's eyes softened. "He's my whole world," she said. I worry about what'll happen to him if I—" She stopped, her voice cracking slightly, but she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Ethan inhaled deeply, the realization settling in his chest like a heavy stone. "I won't let him be alone," he said firmly. "I'll take care of him, and you." Sarah studied him for a long moment before nodding. "I know you will," she said. "But Ethan, taking care of someone isn't just about money." Ethan gave a small, almost self-deprecating smile. "Yeah, I'm starting to figure that out." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of years lost lingering between them. Eventually, Sarah's gaze drifted toward the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance. "You know," she said, a wistful note in her voice, "I used to imagine what it would be like if you came back. I'd think about all the things I'd say. But now that you're here, I just want you to stay a little longer." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "I'll stay," he promised, "as long as you need me." Sarah smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "That's all I ever wanted." Ethan reached out, taking her hand in his. In that moment, he realized that success wasn't about towering skyscrapers or billion-dollar deals. It was about the people who had believed in him when he was just a kid with nothing but a dream. And somehow, sitting there in that tiny apartment, he felt richer than he ever had before. As the night stretched on, Ethan stayed. He listened to Sarah talk about the little things, Lucas's school, her favorite books, the neighbors she liked and didn't like. He let himself be present, letting go of the empire that awaited him outside, if only for a little while. And for the first time in years, Ethan Callahan felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The following morning, sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of Sarah's apartment, casting soft golden hues across the room. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands, staring at the quiet streets outside. The world outside his glass towers felt so distant now, almost foreign. Here, everything moved slower, more deliberately, and yet it felt more real than anything he had experienced in years. Sarah shuffled into the kitchen, wrapped in a blanket, her steps slow but steady. "You're still here," she said with a small smile, as if surprised. Ethan looked up, offering a faint grin. "Yeah, guess I am." She poured herself a cup of tea and sat across from him, her eyes scanning his face with that same gentle intensity she had always had. "You okay?" Ethan chuckled softly. "Funny, I should be asking you that." Sarah shrugged, blowing softly on her tea. "I'm used to it by now," she said. "But you look like someone carrying the weight of the world." He exhaled, rubbing his temples. It's complicated, he admitted. For so long, I've been chasing success, building this empire, thinking that if I just got to the top, everything would fall into place. He glanced down at the bracelet still wrapped around his fingers. But now I realize I might have climbed the wrong mountain. Sarah nodded knowingly. Success has a way of making you forget what really matters. Ethan looked at her, his expression softening. You always knew what mattered, didn't you? She smiled, her gaze drifting to the framed photo of Lucas on the wall. When you have someone to love, it's easier to know. Ethan sighed, leaning back in his chair. I didn't see it before. I thought I had to do it all alone, leave everything behind to prove I was worth something. He looked at Sarah, guilt flickering in his eyes. I should have stayed in touch. I should have helped when you needed it. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed his hand gently. Ethan, I never needed your money. I needed to know that you were okay, that you were happy. Ethan swallowed hard. I thought I was, he said. But now, I'm not so sure. A comfortable silence settled between them, the quiet hum of the city outside filling the gaps. Ethan tapped his fingers on the table, his mind racing with the realization that, for the first time in years, he wanted to be here. Not in a boardroom, not closing a deal, but here, in this small, imperfect kitchen with Sarah and Lucas. After a while, Sarah spoke again, her voice softer now. You know, Lucas looks up to you. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Me? Sarah nodded. He's been reading about you, watching interviews, learning about the things you've built. She smiled. But when he talks about you, it's not the CEO he admires. It's the Ethan I used to know, the one who gave me that bracelet and promised me the world. Ethan felt his chest tighten. I don't even know if that kid exists anymore. Sarah's eyes twinkled. I think he's still in there somewhere. He just got a little lost. Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back. At that moment, Lucas came stumbling into the kitchen, his hair a mess and sleep still in his eyes. He blinked at Ethan in surprise. You stayed? He asked, rubbing his eyes. Ethan smiled. Yeah, kid, I stayed. Lucas grinned. Cool. He plopped into a chair and reached for a box of cereal. Mom makes the best pancakes, he added casually, glancing at Sarah. Ethan chuckled. I might have to stick around for breakfast then. Sarah laughed softly, shaking her head. Looks like we're having company today. As they ate together, sharing stories and laughter, Ethan couldn't help but feel something shift inside him. Maybe it wasn't too late to fix things. Maybe success wasn't about climbing higher, but about finding your way back to the people who mattered most. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he was home. As the morning sun climbed higher, Ethan found himself lingering in Sarah's modest kitchen, the scent of pancakes filling the air. Laughter echoed softly between the walls. Lucas, excitedly talking about his favorite superheroes, Sarah chiming in with playful banter, and Ethan. Ethan just listened. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't thinking about emails, meetings, or deadlines. He was here in the moment, and it felt right. Lucas wiped syrup from his chin, looking up at Ethan with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. So, what's it like being a billionaire? He asked between bites. Ethan smirked, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. Honestly, sometimes it's not as exciting as it looks. Lots of meetings, lots of pressure. He paused, glancing at Sarah. Sometimes you forget why you started in the first place. Lucas tilted his head. Then why do it? Ethan hesitated. Why did he do it? At one point, it had been about survival, about proving to himself and to the world that he could be someone. But somewhere along the way, it had become something else, an endless race, a chase for more. He sighed, setting his mug down. I guess I thought if I just kept going, kept building, I'd finally feel enough. He glanced at Sarah, whose gentle eyes told him she already knew the answer he was only just beginning to realize. But I missed a lot along the way. Lucas chewed thoughtfully. Well, he said, shrugging, you're here now? Ethan chuckled softly. Yeah, I guess I am. Sarah reached across the table, her frail hand resting lightly on his. It's never too late to start again, Ethan, she said. You can't change the past, but you can be here now. For him. She nodded toward Lucas. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He glanced at the boy, at the way he looked at him, not as a billionaire, but as someone who could be more, someone who could show up. I want to, Ethan said, his voice steady but earnest. I want to be here. Sarah smiled, and for the first time, Ethan saw something in her eyes beyond tiredness, relief. As the day stretched on, Ethan found himself staying longer than he had planned. He fixed a loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet, helped Lucas with his homework, and even took a walk to the local park with them. It was small moments like these, ones he had long overlooked, that left the biggest impact. But reality had a way of creeping back in. By late afternoon, his phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket. He finally checked it, sighing at the sight of his assistant's messages. Urgent meetings rescheduled, investors waiting, board members asking questions. The life he had built was waiting, tugging at him, demanding his attention. He stood outside Sarah's apartment, watching as Lucas played with a worn soccer ball in the narrow alleyway. Sarah leaned against the doorframe, watching Ethan with a knowing look. You don't have to stay forever, she said gently. But don't disappear again. Ethan nodded, slipping his phone into his pocket. I won't, he promised. Sarah smiled. You have a good heart, Ethan. You just needed to remember it. Ethan exhaled, looking at Lucas, who waved at him eagerly. Come on, Ethan. Kick the ball. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then, with a small grin, stepped forward and kicked it back, sending it bouncing down the alley. As Lucas chased after it, laughing, Ethan felt something inside him shift. Something real, something that felt more valuable than any deal he had ever closed. He turned back to Sarah. I'll be back soon, he said firmly. And not just to visit. I want to help. Really help. Sarah nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. I believe you. Ethan lingered a moment longer, then, with a final glance at Lucas, made his way down the street. Each step felt different, lighter, more purposeful. He had come here expecting a simple visit, a token act of charity. Instead, he was leaving with something far more valuable, a reminder of who he once was and who he still could be. As he reached the corner, he pulled the bracelet from his pocket once more, running his fingers over the faded beads. He smiled to himself, knowing that this small, worn-out token held more meaning than any award or accolade he had ever earned. Success, he realized, wasn't about what he had built. It was about what he was willing to rebuild. And this time, he was ready to do it right.